mind and repentance. Many things are said about change of mind, about metanoia in the Gospels, which is incorrectly translated as repentance, and really means change of mind. Hence, a great deal has been said about this work, and encouraging us to think in a new way. To those who understand how the work can make us think anew, consider what the work says with regard to the need to think about ourselves, and what the work says about us, what teaching the work gives that refer to things we have to struggle against, and to what purpose. For a long time the work remains external, as something on the whiteboard of memory. However, after a time an individual begins to realize it holds great truth, that they are asleep, possessing negative emotions and other such impediments. Or they may realize some other thing, some other idea that the work presents. This work asks us to think from itself, to form a work mind, one that is built by the ideas of the work, to see things from what this work teaches about ourselves, about others, and about life. When the work becomes emotional, ceasing to remain on the whiteboard, we find ourselves confronted by it. We encounter questions such as, have I misspoken? Have I spent the day in internal considering? Have I remembered myself? Am I identified? Have I made any kind of work effort today? Have I observed myself? Have I cancelled debts? Have I remembered my aim? All these questions and many others begin to stand in front of us, between external life and what we really are inside of ourselves. We begin to understand what it means to think in a new way, and to have another mindset. To have another mind means that the ideas of this work are beginning to stand between us and our lives. We think from our ideas, which means that we begin to have a sense of another discipline of ideas. It means that we begin to feel influences acting upon us that come from the work, and not from external life. All this begins to reveal how we can have a life mind and a work mind as two distinct things. Both are necessary, but they are different kinds of minds. For a long time we have to take some things in one way and others in another. If we reflect upon the work, about some situation, we find that we are thinking quite differently from what we would if we reflected upon the same situation in life. Here, at this point, the work really begins. The question can then be asked about minding, as to what is the difference between not minding and being indifferent. If we do not mind, things do not hurt us. After a time, perhaps, we learn this great lesson in the right way. However, most people think that not to mind means to be indifferent. P.D. Ouspensky observed that indifference is one of the worst states of sleep that one can find themselves in. What difference can we then discern between not minding and being indifferent? We are cautioned that one of the worst things is to be indifferent, and the point of the question is to draw a distinction between not minding and being indifferent. Presently we mind, according to our mindset, which means the object of this work is to change that mind. So what then are our minds? We imagine perhaps that our minds are infinitely flexible. However, such minds as we have are built-up things, acquired influences. We are, for example, through education, told that we must think this or that, imitate the other, and so on. While all of this forms our minds, the mind we go about with in our day-to-day lives. Most of us have rigid minds, in that sense, which means that these acquired minds of ours are parts of personality, of the acquired side of our psychology. It is important to grasp that this work begins with changing our mind, and that means changing the way we think about everything. We may have been taught that we must worry about this or that, so this forms part of our mind, of our acquired mind. Therefore, when this or that happens, we will mind it, because that is our form of mind. We feel that we must mind because our mind has been formed by what we have been taught with regard to this or that. So when any impression falls on us from outside life, that hits our mind in this way, and so we will mind it. We will think of it according to this mind that has been laid down in us, and so will not see any other way of taking the incident that has occurred, to find another way of minding it. It does not occur to us that we need not mind the thing in the way that we do actually mind it. Say, for example, we have been taught that certain people are very bad. Then we will always mind those people, because our acquired mind has been programmed in the manner of minding that way of taking and thinking about certain people. one of the first objectives of the work is to make us think in a new way about everything, including ourselves. P.D. Ouspensky would say that the objective of this work is to make us think with open minds, which means to have different minds. To think in a new way is to have a new mindset, and this means that if we think in a new way, we will not mind all the same things that we did before. We'll be less close-minded. Change of mind is the basis of all esoteric teaching since the period of Christ. The reason being that mankind is now so closed up, so atrophied, and so asleep that the only thing left open for esotericism to touch in us is a route via the mind. For this reason, Christ taught metanoia, or change of mind, as the starting point of esoteric teaching, and we can say that no one today has any chance of awakening, of inner transformation, or of feeling new influences, except through the pathway of their mind. Our mind must change, and the minding of things must change. It's therefore good practice to observe how we mind things, because all of this minding of things depends upon what form our mind has been programmed to take, by example, by how we have been coded through acquired prejudice, imitated attitudes, impressionism, and so on. We take all that has been laid down in our minds, all that prejudice, as quite real, very true, and in fact as the only mind possible. As long as we do this, our minds do not and cannot change. Everyone has certain mental standpoints, certain mental prejudices, certain ingrained ideas as to what is right and wrong. And as long as all these remain unchallenged by the person themselves through attentive self-observation, as long as they are not observed, that person will then continue to mind always in the same way, and will not realize that the ideas of the work seek to change that fixed mind, making them think in quite new ways. For if our mind is fixed, then none of us can think in a new way, and we continue to think only from our preformed mind. Supposing that our mind is fixed and limited in like manner, then we will always mind in a very fixed and limited way. For example, we will feel it is right to be upset about this and angry about that, or depressed about something else, and so on. We will mind all of these things. Why do we mind them? We mind them because that is how our mind works. We mind them because we have been taught all these things, and all about this way of minding. Our mind is indeed an infinite thing, and this thing that we call mind, that we have acquired, is not total mind at all. It is like a little heap of stones on a vast open plain. Something very small and extremely arbitrary, in the sense that one has acquired it without thinking for oneself. One of these pebbles may be your own, but the rest are acquired. We have been taught to make this little heap of stones, and to take it as if it were the whole of our mind, with all of its infinite possibilities of understanding and insight. When something strikes the mind that we cannot entertain, we become indignant, or grow angry because we can only take in as through a little chink, certain things that correspond with, and are reflected by those little heaps of stones that we call our minds. So we go about, as it were, with a very small instrument that has been created more or less haphazardly in us, receiving all life on this minuscule, quite inadequate instrument, that is comprised of that little heap of stones. How do we mind? Have you noticed how you mind things? Are you satisfied with the way you mind things, or could you mind things differently? If you have noticed this, then you are beginning to reach the point of changing your minding, and this means changing your actual mind, then acquiring new mind. To change our neural pathways, new thoughts are necessary. How difficult it is to change our minds. One impediment is that we never observe our minds, or how we mind and why we mind things as we do. We take our minds, and so our minding of everything, for granted, believing that our troubles have nothing to do with our minds or the way they are formed, yet we all know about generational and childhood trauma. We notice that we mind things, but we do not connect that with what kind of minds we have. We fail to grasp that we possess minds having a particular form. We do not attack our minds, suspect our minds, or question anything. All of our mental habits are to us not habits but truths. They are quite right to us. There can be no other point of view, and we defend this quite vigorously, failing to see them as habits, which is the tragedy. We cannot see that so many things we keep on minding so much are due to invisible mental habits. Of course we have to worry, of course we have to think that this is impossible. Of course we have to say we have never heard of such a thing before. Of course we have to say, psh, well, I never, and so on. But why? Because we take our mental habits as ultimate truths, as ultimate standards, failing to realize they are mental habits that we have acquired insensibly over long periods of time, over, in fact, that long dark period that inevitably intervenes, the Dark Ages. Before we start to think for ourselves, about life, and about why we do and say the things that we do and say, and about who we are, it is of course very difficult to realize one's mechanicalness in the three centers. We may notice our mechanicalness in the moving center. However, it takes a long time for most of us to realize our mechanicalness in the emotional and intellectual centers. Those habits of familiar emotion and thought. This work starts with the mind, or intellectual center, and for that reason its approach is called psychological. It does not start from the fakir point of view, with torturing our body and austerities. It does not start with the monk point of view, with breaking emotions. It starts with the mind, as do the Gospels. It starts with changing our mind, and with seeing things differently, from new teaching and therefore new ideas. Unless this begins to take place, unless we start to see mentally ourselves and our lives in new ways, then we cannot expect to work on the other centers, except in a purely unintelligent manner. I may sit all day on my haunches, I may refuse sustenance, I may subject myself to the greatest physical torments as a fakir, but the result will be quite useless, because it is not linked with any understanding, and so leads to no inner development. If I, however, start with my mind and observe, let us say, how I mind things, in what way I mind things, and then ask myself why I mind things in this way, thinking of the work, I will begin to have some insight into the thing I have always taken for granted as being indisputably myself and always right, that I call my mind. I will begin to see that my mind, such as it is, with this little heap of stones in it, is a funny, limited sort of thing, and something that I cannot possibly say is always right. In fact, I will begin to see that my mind is possibly wrong, and that all of my ideas may be wrong too. That in a sense, I have to get rid of this form of mind, of this small way of thinking about everything, and so of this way of minding. Imagine someone coming to you at a moment when you are minding something intensely and saying, "Do you not see that the reason why you mind this so much is because there is something wrong with your mind, that you are wrongly minding and you should try to change your mind instead, thinking in quite a new way about that thing you are stupidly minding so much?" No doubt you would become very agitated. Try to look more deeply into the question of why you mind things, and catch a glimpse of what that is, because there is something in your mind that makes you mind in this way, something in your thoughts, which only comes from your mind, such as it is. For as long as our minds are formed in this manner, they will always produce the same kinds of thoughts. Try to see that we mind the things that we do, because of the heap of stones that we take as the only mind that we can possess. Gurdjieff made his students shout at the top of their voices, "I can work." When you are minding something a great deal, shout to yourself, "I can work," and see what work means at such a moment. Summon up your work mind. All this means that we should observe more deeply what prejudices and ideas we have been taught in the past that make us mind as we do. Suppose we were simply to say to ourselves, "I need not mind in this way," and repeat it. Would that be work? Would that be self-observation? Will that be trying to get down into what one's mind is like, seeing mental mechanicalness? Of course not, because we have to struggle with ourselves more than that, seeing what our stone heaps are like, formed by all of these acquired things, buffers, prejudices, all those little local environmental things that have formed our small minds. Just to say, "I must not mind," then go about with some awful and sanctimonious expression saying, "I must not mind," over and over again, is not this work. It has nothing to do with the work. If we, however, say, "Why do I mind?" then perhaps, through sincere observation, we might notice something in ourselves that has reigned undisturbed, some acquired idea of life or of others, of ourselves that is the cause of that minding so much. We all know how often a person begins to bristle and say in so many words, "Do you mean to say I don't know what is right and wrong?" or a remark of that kind. We must all have noticed that reaction in ourselves, and how quickly we come up against our own level of being. This work is to teach us a new right and wrong, because the objective of the work is to lift us to a more conscious level, where people do not bristle in that way, where people do not mind as they ordinarily mind. The work is to lift us to a level where people's minds are different from our minds, to a level where people mind things differently, where people mind being negative, through the light of their new mindset. P.D. Ouspensky, in talking about attitudes, remarked how marvelous it was that we could find the right attitude to things. Attitude begins as a mental thing. Ouspensky taught, we must understand that attitude starts in our intellectual center. It belongs to the mind. A change of attitude is a change in our intellectual center to begin with. Our mental attitudes affect our emotional center, but their origin lies in the intellectual center, in our minds. People have all sorts of mental attitudes without knowing that they have them. Negative attitudes are like dead places in the mind. Nothing grows there, and it remains barren ground. Instead of thinking, people have an attitude which has been acquired from their upbringing, and imitated from peers or mentors and influences. It is only by thinking in quite new ways that these ingrained attitudes are altered, and the mind is free to think for itself. It should be clear to most of us that our minding comes from mental ideas and attitudes which we take for granted. We are therefore unaware even that we have them. Negative mental attitudes can be called prejudices, and if they increase, they become buffers. Ouspensky said that what people call education is usually, with regard to the mind, nothing more than the acquisition of a number of stereotypical negative attitudes. The mind then becomes almost dead. You must understand, he went on, that the last thing people will do is to think. No one wants to think, because thinking is too difficult for most people. They prefer to go along with the minds they have acquired, and if a person has no magnetic center, then the outlook is extremely unpleasant.